Hello?
Independent and dependent clauses. In order to understand a complex sentence, we need to understand its two components. First, we'll deal with the independent clause. The word independent means it's capable of standing alone. Therefore, an independent clause is capable of standing alone as a simple sentence. We have an example of an independent clause below. This example, she believed in fairy tales. For this, she is the subject, believed in fairy tales is the complete predicate. This sentence, therefore, can stand alone as a simple sentence. You may stop the video here to copy down any information you need.
The next type of clause that we need to discuss is a dependent clause. Dependent means relying on another for support, like you do on your parents. So therefore, this is the antonym to what Mr. Moyer just told us about. A dependent clause relies on an independent clause to form a complex, complete sentence. So therefore, it cannot stand alone. Below you see an example of a dependent clause. When she was younger. The word when is something known as a subordinating conjunction. When you begin with a subordinating conjunction, you know that you're clued in that a dependent clause is on the way. We know this as dependent because when you read this, when she was younger, the sentence is incomplete. It doesn't make sense on its own, and it needs the assistance of an independent clause to make sense and therefore become a complex sentence. Let's move on and talk about subordinating conjunctions because there's a lot more than just the word when. Here is a list of subordinating conjunctions. When you see one of the following subordinating conjunctions, you know you found a dependent clause. Some of the words include after, before, when, whenever, while, that, because. Let's use because as our example. In the past, you have probably heard the term because I said so. Other than being a bad reason for something, this is also an incomplete sentence. This is a dependent clause. I know this because I don't know what you're discussing, I don't know what they're talking about, and also because I see this subordinating conjunction because without an independent clause connected to it. We can turn this dependent clause into a complex sentence by simply adding an independent clause to the beginning of it. So let's slide this down. And what we're going to do is write something like, you can't go to the movies. This is an independent clause because if you read it on its own, it makes sense. We won't put a comma, and I'll discuss that in a second. So, you can't go to the movies because I said so. We now have a complex sentence because in the green we've added an independent clause and in the orange we have a dependent clause. And together, making multiple parts, it becomes a complex sentence. Remember, we can easily pick out the dependent clause in the sentence by looking for the subordinating conjunction, which in this case happens to be because. Let's take a look at some more examples before we wrap up the video.
The last thing we have to talk about with complex sentences is when and when not to use a comma. In this particular sentence, the dependent clause comes first, when she was younger. When the dependent clause comes first, we must use a comma. However, if we put the independent clause first and the dependent clause second, she believed in fairy tales when she was younger, we drop the comma. So whenever we have a dependent clause coming after the independent clause, there is no comma. Thank you for following along with this presentation.